So, John, we're here at Warwick at ASME conference. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's been a lovely conference. It's exciting to see some new friends and also wonderful to connect with old friends as well.
Excellent. So why do you go to conferences?
I think my biggest reason, as I kind of alluded to, is connection. Seeing people that are far along their health professions education journey that are challenging me with new ideas is really important. Also meeting people that are early in that whole conversation that are bringing questions and ideas also raise questions for my own scholarship. And so oftentimes I'm being stimulated, oftentimes I'm learning, but it's that community, that connection. The health professions education world is small. It's wonderful to be a part of it, and it's even better when you're in person.
So we've had a time that we haven't been to conferences for a while. So would you say that connection is what brings you to do it now, or have you been more selective? How does that work for you?
I am still an advocate for technology and for a virtual conference. I appreciate the privilege that I have, the time and the resources to be able to travel, and I know that not everyone can do that. And so sometimes I'm aware that those who are not here in person are not part of that conversation. I think that's a real challenge. But the connection via virtual conference is not the same as in person. The spontaneity, the serendipitous encounter, those conversations that happen often in the hallways after a workshop or after a presentation, those are unplanned, unscripted, and sometimes special. And so there's something unique about an in-person conference, but I'm also still a proponent of the virtual conference for those reasons I articulated.
So we're here at the ASME conference, and the Papers podcast have been fortunate to be doing a live recording. So what does that bring to you? You're used to being in the studio, record the podcast.
Well, first, thanks to ASME for the invitation, and thanks to the Karolinska Institutet for making it possible for us to be here. We typically do our podcast virtually in my office. It used to be in my closet, but I've upgraded to a much better studio. And it's done in a bit of a vacuum. Certainly I had the feedback from Jason, Linda, and Lara, but doing it in front of a live studio audience brings something special and magical. We do this as volunteers. We do this because of our passion for health professions education. But when we have people feedback and laugh at our really tenuous, tedious jokes, when we have people challenge our assumptions and ask questions that we might not have thought of ourselves, that makes the conversation much richer. Sometimes with the podcast, it feels much more like a monologue. We're speaking to an empty void, but with a live studio audience, we begin a conversation.
So what does the listeners mean to you?
The listeners are the main driver for us. We see this as an opportunity to engage in ideas. We appreciate feedback from our audience. We have an email address that we are daily checking to make sure that we are being responsive to that audience. Just a small plug. The email address is thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. Hearing ideas, hearing recommendations for papers, hearing rebuttals for ideas that we have shared on the podcast, that makes it much more real. It increases and enhances the connection that we have.
So why do you have you started podcasting? I mean, you've been podcasting forever.
I think the initial motivation was to do something with friends. And so Jason, Lara, and Linda are close friends of mine, and the opportunity to meet on a monthly basis and to talk about something that we're all passionate about, to continue to grow on our own academic journeys as educators, and to challenge and encourage and support each other, that's probably the prime driver. Secretly, though, it's also one of these force functions. It's almost like a choice architecture for me to help maintain my own currency. So as an educator, I want to keep up to date with the literature, and I have great intentions, much like my great intention to exercise regularly. But without having some accountability, I'm not sure if I'd be as great at keeping up with the medical education and health professions education literature. And so preparing for the podcast, being thoughtful and kind of continually surveilling the literature as a function of needing to meet podcast deadlines, that's how I'm trying to keep my own professional development moving forward.
So how do you choose those papers to get in there?
Well, I think we have a system. It's a semi-structured system. Each month from, probably about 10 of the health professions education journals, I get the electronic table of contents, and I just do a scanning exercise to say what's happening there. Sometimes there's recommendations from viewers and audiences, and I'll pay attention to those recommendations, although I'm not promising that every recommendation will make it onto the show. Sometimes in social media, I will see controversies or conversation erupting, and I'll be drawn to that. Selection is along one main idea of, is it going to be meaningful to a larger conversation? Is it going to spark discussion? Is it going to be something that is going to be the topic of debate or of attention in my own teaching practice, in my own university, in my own hospital? And could I imagine equally it could be relevant and applied in hospitals and universities and educational centers around the world? And so we choose a topic maybe because it raises a question about a methodology. We choose a topic maybe because the results are transferable to a number or generalizable to a number of other settings. Or maybe it serves as a lever to have a conversation about an issue that collectively, as the health professions education community, we should be having.
So, in short, a good paper for you is a paper that could start a good conversation?
A good conversation around an issue, around the results from the paper, or around the approach, the methods that they adopted.
So what are you curious about our listeners?
I want to know if they really side with me on all the debates that Lara and I have. I have a feeling that Lara is winning in the popular vote, but I'm hoping that I might be narrowing that gap. I certainly want to know and affirm that I'm beating Jason in all the debates that we're having, but I don't need that evidence. I'm pretty confident that's happening. What I'd really like to know is, what did they find works? What did they really value about the podcast? But we really want to make it a podcast that's relevant for the community. And so I am very open. I think all of us are very open. And Teresa, I know as the executive producer, you're very open to hearing from the community about where we should go, what we should modify, where we can do better. And that kind of feedback is something that we really want to hear, because we're doing this as part of our contribution to the health professions education community. We've received so much from it, and this is our opportunity to continue to enhance and to nurture that collective work that we are all doing.
Could you say, like, hearing from our listeners is a way to continue the conversation?
One of the best parts about being here at ASME were people coming up to me in the halls and saying, I really enjoyed that episode, or this is something that's part of my regular listening in my podcast queue, or I thought you really dropped the ball on this topic, and have you ever considered that? And the answer usually is, I didn't consider it, and yes, in hindsight, I agree that I probably dropped the ball there. And so that was the best part, hearing from people reflecting back on how the podcast is helping or how the podcast could be enhanced. Please, we would love to hear from you.
Human dimensions of education, what would that mean?
Right now, in every kind of corner of the education community that I'm walking into, the rage is around technology, what generative AI will do and change. And I'm a big proponent, and I'm seeing it in my own scholarship, and I'm trying to incorporate it into my own educational practice. But I think we need to be really cautious that technology or Skynet is not going to be a simple replacement for the human element in education. For all of our tactics and for all of our tips around how to be more effective as a teacher, I think a core principle that builds off everything is this idea of trust. It's a vulnerable act of learner and teacher, of that connection, of that dyad, and it builds from trust. The assessment of a learner need and the divulging of learning goals builds from this idea of trust. And trust is not something you build with your device, or trust is not something that you build with a neural network. Trust is something that is built over a relationship, person to person. And from that trust builds the confidence to be vulnerable, builds the confidence to receive feedback, builds the confidence to iterate and to practice, builds the confidence to develop autonomy. And in the absence of trust, I'm not sure that effective learning can happen, or how we can continue to grow and develop as teachers.
Excellent. Thank you, John.